Since 2014, more than 3 million Iraqis have been displaced and another 260,000 have been forced to flee to neighboring countries. The Iraqi refugee crisis is the result of decades of conflict and violence in the region. In 2014, an escalation of violence surged when the Islamic State, otherwise known as ISIS, launched attacks in northern Iraq. As a result of the conflict, millions of families were forced to flee their homes and half of the country's infrastructure was destroyed. Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, more commonly known as ISIS, is a Sunni jihadist group led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi with a particularly violent ideology that calls itself a caliphate and claims religious authority over all Muslims. ISIS was inspired by al-Qaeda, but was later publicly expelled from the group. However, before ISIS was created, there was still a lot of conflict going on in Iraq.
Oh dear, just when you thought the Iraq problem was solved because you haven't heard about it for a while, everything's back to murderous chaos and terror. What happened? In 2003, the US invaded Iraq because of its alleged connections to terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. At the time, Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator, ruled the country. He was part of the Sunni minority and suppressed the Shia majority. Iraq was conquered fairly quickly, but the US had no plan for the country. The until then suppressed Shia majority took over and began oppressing the Sunnis because suppressing other faiths has proven to be such a good idea. Unsurprisingly, a Sunni rebel uprising began and terrorist groups like al-Qaeda trickled into Iraq and local forces, often former Sunni military, began fighting the US troops and the newly formed Iraqi state, peaking in a bloody civil war in 2006. Since then, people in Iraq have basically been segregated by religion. So, in a tragic irony of history, the US invasion led to the formation of the very terrorists the US wanted to eliminate in the first place, because Iraq was now the perfect training ground for terrorism. To understand this complicated conflict better, we need to understand the relationship between the two main branches of the Muslim faith, Shia and Sunni Islam. Sunnis make up about 80% of the Muslim world and Shia about 20%. And the hardliners on both sides don't like each other very much. Saudi Arabia and Iran are the two most powerful players in the game of faiths. They both have no separation of state and religion, domestic problems, and a lot of oil money. And they support groups that fight the other religious orientation. And one of those terror organizations supported by Saudi Arabia was the Islamic State in Iraq, or ISI for short. In 2010, the Arab Spring happened and changed the whole situation in the Middle East. In Syria, dictator Bashir al-Assad didn't think much of resigning and started a gruesome civil war against his own people. The longer the war went on, the more foreign groups joined the fight, most of them for religious reasons and with the goal of building an Islamic State in the region. And one of them was the infamous ISI, which now became the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. They had fought in Iraq for years and had thousands of well-trained and fanatic soldiers. They already quasi-controlled parts of northern Iraq and were very determined to build their religious state. And they changed the game in Syria like no one expected. ISIS was so unbelievably violent and radical that soon it was at war with almost every other faction of the Syrian rebel armies. They attacked and killed members of other Muslim terrorist groups. In the territories they controlled, they built an Islamic State with rules so strict that even the hardliners of al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia were shocked and withdrew their support. ISIS has been accused of responsibility for multiple massacres against civilians, countless suicide bombings, the hostage-taking of women and children, the execution of their prisoners, and beheadings.
Currently, ISIS attacks in Iraq and Syria have increased significantly in 2020, demonstrating both capacity and willingness on ISIS's part to retake territory, populations, and resources. In the wake of COVID-19 and the drawdown of the U.S. forces, security gaps have worsened, allowing ISIS to move more freely, get more prison breaks, carry out more sophisticated attacks, and smuggle fighters across borders. The majority of people who remain in the country are now in refugee camps. Although a significant number of internally displaced people returned to their homes in 2018, they continue to face significant challenges in terms of security, access to essential services, and livelihoods.